This is FRM Part 1, Book 4, Valuation and Risk Models, and the chapter on stress testing and other risk management tools. As I was reading the chapter, I was struck by its brevity, but also its clarity about stress testing. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to read this definition of stress testing that I got from the previous chapter, and it's in a footnote of all places. And you guys know I can't read with my glasses. Stress testing, exercises used to conduct forward-looking assessments of the potential impact of various adverse events and circumstances on a banking institution. Now that sounds like a terrific definition of what we spent the last chapter on. Remember, I gave you that whole scenario of, you got the liabilities over here, you got the assets over here, and we're trying to stress them. We're actually kind of playing Chicken Little. You guys around the world know what Chicken Little is. Chicken Little was the dude who used to run around saying, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And everyone would say, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, what are we going to do? And then the sky never fell. Of course, in stress testing and in financial risk management in general, what we know is the sky is going to fall sooner or later, and we better be prepared for it. And so, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, financial risk managers have developed, pretty sophisticated models to do this stress testing. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those inside of this chapter. But I do want to remind you that, prior to 2007 and 2008, the stress testing of market risks pretty much was done, either at the transaction level or at the portfolio level. But the stress testing of credit risk was primarily and almost solely done at the transaction level. Of course, after 2008, that's why enterprise-wide stress testing became so much more popular, because it was a little bit more complete and a little bit more complex. So we're probably not surprised to see only a handful of learning objectives here. We're going to talk about the relationship between stress testing and some other risk measures like value at risk and economic capital. We'll talk about some advantages and disadvantages, and then we'll look at some stress inputs. All right, let's go ahead and start with this enterprise-wide stress testing. So remember, I did this several chapters ago. We got this big old umbrella of the entire enterprise, and then you have these, different silos. And we talked about the importance of not looking at these silos individually and independently and without thinking of the impact that changes in the value of those silos is going to have within and around the firm. So you need to do these things considering co-integrations and correlations and all that kind of stuff. Now, of course, look at my first sentence there. Stress testing plays a large role, a completely large role in determining banks' capital adequacy because of what happened, in 2007 and 2008. And so stress testing, though, should probably be utilized in conjunction with some other things, like economic capital and value at risk. So let's talk about some similarities between stress testing and value at risk, and then we'll look at some differences on the next slide. So both stress testing and the value at risk are used by financial institutions, of course, for the purpose of risk management. And this is exactly what I've said to you, if not 100% of the videos, at least 70% of them. Identify the risks, quantify the risks, and then manage the risks. And then for both of these risk measurement tools, the inputs are used as scenarios, and then they're also involved in trying to determine, some kind of a loss. So we do this scenario analysis. We change up some of these inputs and say, okay, if this happens, does the sky really fall all the way down to earth, or does it just fall a little bit lower so that the cloud cover is only 100 feet up there rather than 150 feet? I know nothing about clouds and science, so I'm making all that stuff up. How about differences here? This is an important one. The stress test is an accounting viewpoint, but the value at risk and economic capital takes a market view. Stress tests are longer time periods, but the value at risk and economic capital, this is at a given point in time. Of course, remember, we spend lots of good moments on value at risk. You can compute this over a day's time period or a week or a month or a year or a decade or a century for that matter. Can't imagine what a value at risk over the next century of $10 million might mean, but maybe it means something to somebody. Of course, stress testing doesn't really involve the probabilities, although there are kind of implicit probabilities when we change some of those inputs into the scenario analysis framework. There's a probability of that being changed. So there's a little bit of an implicit probability, but of course, value at risk depends primarily on probabilities. And then the final difference is the measurement of expected losses and unexpected losses. Of course, you got to be concerned about conditional and unconditional, which we did a chapter or two ago. And here's a good summary table of the similarities and the differences between these two. This is probably a good table to memorize. Now, one of the things that we try to do as good financial risk managers, and I draw this thing, so we have, there's a normal distribution, and of course, it doesn't have to be a normal distribution. It could be some crazy distribution. I don't know what that distribution is, but so we have some distribution, and we want to figure out what that loss distribution is. Now, we can do that using the value at risk, but then we need to ask ourselves the question: all right, what if this stress test and the losses that result from these stress tests, where do they fit? I'm just doing the continuous on the horizontal axis there. What if one of those losses is part of that larger distribution? Then we can swing back and try to figure out the probabilities. Now, of course, this big organization back in 2011, they came up with lots of rules, and they came up with this one here. Banks should calculate a stressed value at risk based on 10-day, 99 percentile, one-tailed confidence interval value at risk measure for their current portfolio with all those model inputs, and then continue to do this, going forward. Of course, we need to figure out how default risk relates to counterparty credit risk. And then that, of course, brings in the conversation this credit valuation adjustment. Remember, we talked about this some time ago, when we have positions in these derivatives and one of the counterparties might wave to us from across the market and say, you know what, I'm going on vacation. I'm not going to show up on the maturity date of the derivative or the expiration date of the derivative. So we have to adjust the value of that derivative to reflect that extra risk. A risk metric with a stressed input is usually more conservative. And what that means is that if we have, let's just say we need $1 million as part of this whole stress testing output, that capital, that $1 million in capital, is probably going to be sufficient, even under the conditions of that particular stressed event which we were testing, or maybe even a shock. So the good news is that it's probably more conservative, but the bad news is that risk metric using that stressed input probably loses some responsiveness to current market conditions. In other words, since we're more conservative, we're probably not going to be as sensitive to those conditions. But of course, it's going to depend on the portfolio composition. Let's start with key elements of effective governance. All right, so what did I say in that first slide? It's a broad term used to describe the firm's examination of its risk and the potential impact of stressful events. And of course, stress testing gained lots and lots of popularity and importance going way back to 1987, when we had the big old stock market crash in October of that year. And then it was exacerbated back in 2007 and 2008. All right, so what are we trying to identify here? Potential risk exposures. In other words, is our risk exposure primarily in consumer lending? Is it in business lending? Or is it in some other operations of the business? So stress testing is ultimately the responsibility of the management, of course, the corporate leaders and the board of directors. The stress testing program should be guided by clear, well-detailed policies. I mean, this sounds exactly like anything that you've talked about under corporate governance. What we're doing is applying those corporate governance principles to the governance over stress testing. So it makes sense that we should have consistent documentation, stress testing results, and methodology. And then, of course, just like we talked about in the previous chapter, we ought to ask somebody over there to come in and say, hey, you know what, let us know what we're doing well and what we're doing poorly. And so there is a great need for an independent review, and that independent review can be done internally and it can be done externally, although the external evaluation, might have a little bit more importance. Responsibilities of the board of directors. I've said this to you guys before. Essentially, what does the board do? The board hires and fires the corporate leaders, and they do so because of the responsibility given to them as a result of the shareholder vote for them to become members of the board. So really, the board of directors is ultimately responsible for the strategy of the business and is responsible for the firm's stress test. That's why if you go to any of these financial institution webpage and you look on the board of directors and you look at the committees and you look at the structure and you look at the activities and the regular meetings, they emphasize on their web pages that, hey, we are continuously involved. We have continuous review. We integrate the stress test into our decision making, and we help establish these guidelines for stress testing. And this should make perfect sense that you've got the board up here like this, the board of directors up here, the umbrella, and then that information can flow this way and it can flow that way from the corporate leaders. And it's got to be flowing upward and it's got to be flowing downward. Now, ultimately, the board of directors is going to be responsible for establishing the tolerance for risk for the financial institution, and that is one of the implicit instructions that the shareholders give the board when they vote for the board. All right, so think about the board as the strategic part of stress testing, and then the actions are the responsibilities of the senior management. So notice some of those bolded points I have there, that stress testing guidelines implemented to the letter, keep the board up to date, make certain that everybody understands the importance of stress testing, be able to identify inconsistencies and contradictions and possible gaps, and then prepare for all possible scenarios. In the previous chapter, I drew a little bit of a tree so that we have all of these different possibilities. Remember, we called that scenario analysis. And so what we're really trying to figure out is, what is the frequency of the loss and what is the severity of the loss? Those are some mathematical things that we talked about in the previous chapter. And then, of course, we have all of this information. And so we know where the gaps are, we know where the inconsistencies are, and we know where our strengths are. And so it's the responsibility then of the senior managers to identify and establish these risk mitigation strategies. Of course, stress testing policies and procedures should, there's all these circle points, and these should make perfect sense. Describe the overall goals, outline stress testing practices, outline roles and responsibilities, provide guidance, specify frequency, guidance on processes followed, how stress testing results ought to be used and where that flow should go, and then regular updates. So those policies, they make perfect sense. Those are common sense. And if you guys were in charge of putting together a document on an efficient and an effective stress testing strategy, you would come up with these kinds of things here. Now, stress testing activities should be well documented. And so you think about all of the documents, think about all the papers that you guys have written during your life, including the poorly written ones too. I mean, I've written a bunch of junk papers in my day. And so what must you have in these documents? You got to have some kind of an introduction, and you have to identify the problem, and you talk about the assumptions that you made, the methodologies and how you collect your data, if any, limitations and uncertainties, and then test results. That's pretty much kind of like a standard scientific method. But remember, this document has to have a beginning and it has to have a purpose, and then at the end it has to have some concluding remarks that relate directly back to that purpose. Now, of course, when this document is well developed and well crafted and well written and easily understood by all of those within side of the financial institution, there are lots of advantages here. So trends in risk exposures, transparency, we hear that word all the time these days, promotes transparency, provides continuity, and of course there's the feedback loop that we can improve the process. And so this is important for financial institutions to convince everybody inside of the organization that this is an important and critical function to the success of the institution. And so then there's the improvements of the process over time. We need to, of course, validate the activities, and we need to have an independent review. So what is this going to do for us? Ensures that validation and independent review are conducted on an ongoing basis. I mean, ongoing probably doesn't mean minute by minute, but clearly it means, at a minimum monthly, but probably weekly or bi-weekly. I mean, these corporate leaders, these financial institution leaders, they get together, they have lunch together. And so this should be part of the ongoing process and ongoing conversations. All right, so subjective or qualitative aspects. Remember, there's going to be lots and lots of quantitative stuff, and we've done lots of mathematics here in many of these chapters that we've talked about, but there are also going to be opinions. Remember, I've said this to you guys before, that there is a science to this financial risk management. There's definitely a science. I mean, you can calculate the value at risk, and that is a mathematical output. But interpreting that, and then using that interpretation to improve the process going forward and to lessen the probability of losses in the future. I mean, that's really opinions, that's subjective stuff. So those opinions have to be validated and reviewed. We've talked a little bit about this idea of behavioral finance. We're all influenced by behavioral influences, whether they come from weaknesses in our brain, we call those cognitive errors, or emotions or feelings from our hearts or souls. We can become biased. So we need this review to come in, these reviewers to come in and say something, hey Jim, you're just not thinking clearly for the following reasons. And I might have the response, I might say, well, my mother didn't like this about banking, and so they're making decisions, et cetera, and that would be a personal behavioral issue. We need to acknowledge limits. We need to acknowledge data weaknesses. That's one thing that I know in publishing research and working on my dissertation, is that you can work as hard as you possibly can to collect all of this data, but it's not ever going to be perfect data. My dissertation chairman used to say to me all the time, he would say, hey, look, Jim, are you certain that you have this entire sample for this time period? And I would say, no. How can I possibly know of everything that has gone on inside of my topic area? But I did the best I could. I mean, I read the Wall Street Journal, I did all this stuff, and et cetera, et cetera. All right, where are we here on those block points? So sufficient independence, that's important. Third party models, validation and review. And then look at the bottom block point there, in a rigorous manner. So we're making certain that we don't ask the question, oh, what if somebody shows up at our financial institution and wants to withdraw the $500,000 that they deposited last week? We need to make certain that we do this in a rigorous manner so that we collect samples of all those people. and we project what those consequences are going to be. How about the internal audit in stress testing? So what should the internal audit do? Independently evaluate the performance and integrity and reliability of stress testing activities. So the internal audit has got to be something that sounds like, you know what, this is what we're doing. We're going to look at the integrity of this audit and this stress testing process, and we're going to see if it's reliable, if it holds up under different conditions. In other words, suppose somebody does come in and withdraws that $500,000, and then on that day, bank profitability soars. Well, you know, we might rely on the conclusion that, hey, every time someone withdraws lots of money from our institution, this is good news, which clearly is not going to be the case. All right, so that the stress tests are conducted in a sound manner across the organization. So remember, financial institutions are not just one building. You know, I mean, there are branches and there are parents and there are subsidiaries, and so you've got these buildings spread out all over the place, and so you need to make sure that there's consistency. Expertise of the staff has to be emphasized. I mean, of course, you have to have people who know what they're doing. Whenever there's a change in these stress testing policies, that needs to be appropriately documented and approved by the right people. And then, of course, this independent review comes on, and then somebody needs to review the independent review. All right, so look at the bottom arrow point. Internal audit staff must be well qualified, technical experts, etc., etc. All right, what did I say to you guys in the previous chapter? Remember in the introduction, I talked about looking at this operations of a financial institution from the balance sheet perspective. And so you have this balance sheet. You have the deposits up on the top right, and then you've got, you know, notes and bonds in the middle right, and then you have equity in the bottom right. And then over on the left-hand side, you have all of these performing assets. And so the stress testing coverage has to include all that stuff in there. Notice the first circle point there. Some areas of the business are ignored or left out. Well, then this is not a complete information set. This is not a complete and reliable stress test. Now, of course, what we need to do is make certain that we identify what are the short-term horizon risks and what are the long-term horizon risks. And then we need to define short-term. Is that a day? Is that a week? Is that a month? What is the long-term? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 50 years? So we need to make certain that we differentiate between short-term and long-term. Now, some of those risks are going to be related and they're going to be interdependent, but there are some things that are uniquely short-term and some that are uniquely long-term. Now, there's the next block point. Notice that I talk about the interrelationships between and among the various risks and those business lines. That's why in that previous video, remember we had those 8 business lines, and then we had the sensitivity measure, we had the beta for one of those measures of risk in that previous chapter. And these stress tests, of course, they've got to be done here, they've got to be done here, they've got to be done here. So portfolio level, the department level, and for the enterprise or the organization as a whole. All right, during scenario analysis, the scenario tested, and what did I say to you earlier, like a baseline and adverse conditions and then severely adverse conditions. And so what this has to do, these have to be created and crafted that link back with that long-term strategic plan set by the board of directors. So this range of scenarios should be wide enough to incorporate sufficiently severe outcomes. And really, it's extremely helpful to put on our rear view sunglasses and just go back to 2007 and 2008 and examine that time period and say, okay, what did these financial institutions do poorly that led them to either A, have a need to be taken over by another institution, or be bailed out by the federal government, or that they just ceased to exist after those problems. All right, so what we need to do is establish the reliability and the relevance of the enterprise-wide aggregated results so that we can look at, and remember we call this in in corporate finance we call this, and investments and even derivative securities we call this unsystematic and systematic risk. But in the financial risk management world, we call these specific risk to this particular financial institution, and then those that are systematic throughout the entire financial institution industry. Now, of course, the type of stress testing should be rooted and couched and etched into the reality of that particular financial institution, but also must incorporate hypothetical scenarios. And this is the fun type of stress testing, when you can sit down with your colleagues and say, okay, what's the worst thing that it can happen? Here's our portfolio of mortgage loans. What's the worst thing that can happen? And so you can list some of those things, and you could say, all right, let's create a scenario. Let's create a scenario where these severe poor outcomes are going to capture our mortgage portfolio, and then what does that do to things like value and risk and all those sorts of things. Now, once again, we've got to link this stress testing and then the capital requirements. Okay, so remember, down the bottom right side of the balance sheet, we have this equity, so we need all this capital, and then we need access to liquidity on the top left of the balance sheet. And so this has to be part of the board of directors' establishment of this strategic plan and the annual planning cycle. Here's my favorite block point on this page: should seek to reveal how cash flows would be affected. Remember that my training goes all the way back to 1958 with that wonderful capital structure paper by Modigliani and Miller, where the emphasis was on the ability of the firm to generate cash flow. So I love any kind of a conversation in which we test for stress, and then we compute those operating cash flows or free cash flows, or however the institution wants to define those cash flows, and how those cash flows are going to be affected. Because essentially that's what the shareholders want, right? The shareholders invest, the owners of the financial institution invest in the financial institution because they believe that the executives are going to generate lots and lots of cash flows, and then those shareholders are going to be able to either get some dividend payments or buy low and sell high on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. We need to do all this stuff with subsidiaries as well. So if the subsidiary faces a liquidity issue or a capital crisis, then how is the parent company going to react? And is that localized in the subsidiary, or is it contagious among other subsidiaries? And does that stress test flow up to the parent? So stress tests should simulate the effects of capital problems and liquidity problems that happen at the same time. Wow. And that takes us through this relatively short chapter.